Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint in the Week 10 module on rhetorical analysis essays. So how to write about arguments, right? Our course project, what you've been working on, has been designed to help you develop and present your own argument, right? But one other element that we have been working with in some of the assignments and in the weekly discussions is analyzing other people's arguments, right? Because that's just as important as knowing how to present your own. So our final exam essay will be a rhetorical analysis essay. You will be choosing a topic and writing a rhetorical analysis essay. That means you will be writing an essay that analyzes how that argument works. Remember, we're not here to talk about our opinions of the argument. This isn't about whether or not we think the argument was successful or if the argument failed. We are simply analyzing how the argument was put together, how it works, right? Because remember, analysis is looking at all the parts to figure out how it works as a whole. And having a reaction to the argument, that doesn't fit in with a rhetorical analysis essay. Rhetorical analysis is very objective. You're going to stay on the outside and simply tell us in a very objective way how that argument was set up and how it worked. So how do you figure out what all the parts are that you're going to look at to tell us how the argument works? That's what we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint. So step one, I would suggest performing a trace analysis on the argument. So remember the trace analysis, TRACE was an acronym, T-R-A-C-E. We worked with this earlier in the quarter. So the first thing is describe the text. That's what the T stands for. You're all going to be choosing from images. There's no written arguments as an option for the final exam essay. It's all images. So describing the text in this case, you are simply going to describe and list the elements of the image. That could be the pictures as well as possibly some words, right? Who, and then the R is for reader. Who is the reader? Who is the intended audience? Can you tell? If it's not clear, then consider if you can tell what organization created the visual, if you know anything about where it appeared originally, that might be able to give you a sense of who the intended audience was. And then the A is for author. Who is the author or the publisher? Who created or distributed the image? You may not be able to answer this question, but try to come up with as much as you can in terms of who or where the image was released to the public. C was for constraints. What constraints might the author or audience have about the issue presented? So remember, constraints is if someone is presenting me an argument that has something to do with politics or a political issue, or it's being presented by a political organization. If I am very untrustworthy of politicians and politics, then that's a constraint on my part because I won't, sorry, my phone just went off, because I won't necessarily even want to pay attention to the argument. I will already have a wall built up that prevents me from really engaging with the argument and giving it a real shot, if you will. So constraints. What are some constraints that might be present for the arguer as well as the audience? And then the E was exigence. And remember, exigence is what prompted the creation of the argument. So in this case, it's an image. What prompted the creation of that image? what was going on in the community or in the nation or in the world that prompted this person or this group of people to create this image and distribute it to the public. Okay. Now, you don't have to necessarily write down a bunch of sentences and paragraphs when you're doing a trace analysis. You can just jot down some notes about each element, each letter, T-R-A-C-E. And it's really just to get your mind in the right place and to start thinking about the image in a more objective way. Okay. After you've done that, the next thing you want to do, step 2, is looking at the claim. What is the main claim for this argument? What type of claim is it? In other words, what is the argument working towards? Does it seek to make the audience evaluate the worth of something? So in other words, is it a claim of value? Does it seek to make the audience believe something about the past, the present, or the future? Meaning, is it a claim of fact? Or does it seek to make the audience want to do something? Or that we would urge other people to do something, which would be a claim of policy. Okay, so what is the claim and what type of claim is it? Step 3 is looking at the line of reasoning. And the line of reasoning is sort of like the main points, like they start as here, and then as we've learned, they explain that, which leads them to their next point, and then they explain that, which leads them to their next point. The line of reasoning. What are the individual premises that are asserted, right? So we have to establish this first, and then they make us think about this, and then they make us think about this. How do they go from one to the next? What are those premises, those sort of main points, those main ideas? How do they lead us to accept that main claim, or do they? What premises are unstated? What do we sort of have to figure out in our minds or already accept in our minds that they didn't necessarily put in the argument for us? What points do we as the reader or the viewer have to fill in? Okay. So after you've looked at the line of reasoning, step 4 then is to look at evidence and examples. How does it rely on allusion or scenarios or illustrations, anecdotes, personal testimony, facts or statistics? How do those specific forms of evidence or examples function in the overall argument? How do they support the main claim? Or are they used within an appeal somehow? Again, we're going to be dealing with images for this rhetorical analysis essay. So evidence and examples are going to be very limited, but that's not to say that they will be totally absent from the image. They could still be there. But we all know that most images and posters and advertisements are going to rely on appeals to boost its arguments and get us to accept it. So ethos, pathos, and logos. So the logos kind of goes with the evidence and examples. There's probably going to be like statistics and things like that would show up on an image. But pathos and ethos could be used. Remember, ethos is an appeal to character, either the author's character or they're using someone that they think we would find credible in the image to help boost the argument. Pathos, though, that's emotion, appealing to our values, appealing to our needs and our motivations. As we've seen throughout the quarter, that's relied upon heavily in visual argument. So consider those very carefully, right? How are they appealing to fear, anger, hope, regret, safety, belonging, sex? What kind of shared values are they hoping that we share with them? Courage, peace, honor, trust, personal responsibility, knowledge, wisdom, things like that. Okay. After you have looked at how the argument is being supported, step 6 is looking at how the opposition is handled. Now, again, This might not show up very much in visual argument, at least not explicitly, but there might be some subtle hints at what the opposition might be. So does it engage the opposition in any way, directly or indirectly? Is it refuting any kind of claim? Is it granting value to another position? Is it make any kind of concession? Are they qualifying their claim in any way because of what they know the opposition would say in return? I'm not sure that a whole lot of opposition is going to be presented directly in any of the images you have to choose from, but I still think you should consider what the opposing claims would be and then go back and say, okay, this is probably what the opposition would say. Has the image addressed those claims in some subtle way that we don't necessarily see immediately? All right. So after you have looked at the opposition, step 7 is to go back and pay more attention to the values and assumptions in the visual. What assumptions do you detect? What are they assuming about us? Do they point to any underlying values? Right? Remember our values. You can look on page 72 for more examples, but those shared ideas and values like courage, honesty, community, creativity, wisdom, independence, courage, all of those. So how are values and assumptions being played upon in the visual? So 7 steps there to sort of get you to think about all the different pieces of an argument. We're dealing with visual argument, so some of them aren't really going to be used heavily in the argument, but you should still consider them because you never know, especially depending upon which image you choose to work with. Some of them might consider the opposition more than others. So go through all 7 steps, right? Some of them you may not come up with very many answers for. Others, you're going to come up with a whole lot of answers for. But go through all 7 steps. How you're doing this is up to you. I would suggest at least having a notebook and jotting down all your answers to those 7 steps, because that's going to sort of be the material you draw from in order to write the essay. Because the rhetorical analysis essay is asking you to analyze the argument. So you have to talk about all the different parts of the argument that work together to form the whole thing. Those 7 steps walk you through all the different elements of an argument. So you're going to draw from your answers to those 7 steps to write the essay. You're not going to use everything that you jot down, but what you use in the essay should be in your notes somewhere, right? So how do you then go about putting all that information together in an essay? There are 2 ways that you can organize a rhetorical analysis essay. All right, so we're going to talk about those. But keep in mind, this is an essay. So the first thing you're going to need is an introductory paragraph. That introductory paragraph should function just like it does in every other kind of essay. It needs to grab the reader's attention, it needs to introduce the overall subject of the essay, and then it needs to offer a thesis statement. So the thesis statement is what you believe are the major players in the argument, the major elements of the argument that work together to form the whole. That's what I'm saying. You may not, that's why I said you might not use everything that you jot down in your notes as you go through those 7 steps. You're going to look through and figure out which ones are the most important, which ones play the biggest role in creating the overall argument that we see. Whatever you decide are the most important elements of the argument, that work together, you're going to mention those in your thesis statement. And that's what you're going to analyze and explain in the body of the essay. Okay? So how you organize the body of the essay, there's usually two common methods of organization. I'm going to talk about sequential first, even though it's discussed second in the PowerPoint. I'm going to talk about sequential first because I think it's probably the least of the two when it comes to visual argument, because sequential means in time order, right? Now, if you were analyzing a speech, you could very easily do it in sequential order because you could analyze the beginning of the speech first, and then the middle of the speech, and then the conclusion of the speech. But we're using visuals. So if you wanted to use a sequential method of organization, that means you would have to take us through each section of the image. So you would start like with the top, and then the middle of the image, and then the bottom of the image. Or you could go left, middle, right. You could go visual and then text if there's any words on your visual argument. But that's what we mean by sequential. And when we're applying it to a visual image, then it's not really in order like time. It's really more about in order of appearance, so to speak. I think more than likely a visual image lends itself more to a rhetorical arrangement. So in this case, you are arranging your main points according to the rhetorical strategies that you're going to discuss in the argument. So you might talk about the claim first, and then you might talk about the support that's being used, and then you might talk about the appeals that are being used, and then the values and assumptions that are present. Whatever of those 7 steps that you have decided are the biggest components of the argument, then that's how you would arrange the body of the essay. And you could sort of go sort of like in order. First, you have to have a claim, then you have to have support, then you have to think about values and assumptions, and then you have to, so you could go through it, organize it like that, or you could organize it according to what you think were the most important strategies used. So you could talk about the claim first, and then, they used a little bit of logic, so we're going to talk about that next, but they really relied on pathos, so we're going to end there. Or we're going to talk about the claim first, and then we're going to look at how they engaged the opposition, because they did a little bit, but it's definitely not the biggest part of the argument. And then we're going to look at the support, right? So you could do it by sort of order of importance, starting with what was, an important strategy used, but not the most important strategy used, and then the next most important, and then you end with the most important strategy that was used in the argument. So those 7 steps that you follow to sort of get all of your ideas and everything that you want to say about the argument, you're going to pull, again, the most important ones, the most hard-hitting ones, and then you can decide what order you need to discuss them in. I think that is a little easier to do with visual argument than a sequential arrangement. But that's not to say sequential is totally out of the question. If you can figure out a way to make it work, go for it. But that's kind of how you want to organize the material. Think about how it makes the most sense to discuss the argument that's presented in the visual. I will also it's not really giving you a hint, maybe some advice. I know that most of the time in my follow-up videos to the discussions, I just went through the order of the questions that you had to answer, but sometimes I talked about one element first, like I didn't necessarily go in order of the questions. And that's kind of, that might be a clue for you as to what you should, if you choose one of those images, what should you discuss first? For instance, the last two posters that we looked at, Girls Say Yes and the AIDS prevention poster. I talked about some other things first before I started going in order of the questions, or I would say, okay, I think we need to look at this question first, actually, before we get into these other questions. Just use your best judgment. Just make sure that it makes sense, the order in which you take us through the elements of the argument that you have chosen to discuss. Remember, the goal of the rhetorical analysis essay is to examine how an argument works. You might need to provide a little bit of summary or background information after your introductory paragraph, depending on which image you choose, and that's fine, but remember, it should just be a real brief paragraph of background information. We want the majority of the essay to focus on your analysis of the parts of the argument and how they work together. Most importantly, though, avoid the 4 common pitfalls. If you remember this, we talked about them earlier in the quarter. Do not make a case. That means don't talk about your reaction to the argument. Don't involve yourself in the argument or the issue at hand. Be super objective. Keep your reaction and your personal opinion of the issue out of it completely. Don't describe the effect, right? We don't know if, because a lot of the images weren't necessarily created during the present day. So if you're dealing with, say, for instance, the Girls Say Yes poster, that's from the 60s and 70s. We don't know what the effect of that poster was. We can't talk about that, right? We also don't want to start trying to talk about the intent. We know what they intended the argument to be, but that's it. We don't know anything about what they intended the audience to do, or, we don't know anything about the intent. And we don't want to evaluate. We don't want to start getting into whether or not the argument was successful or if it failed. This is literally just, because you could do a rhetorical analysis for an argument that failed miserably, and it would sound exactly the same as a rhetorical analysis for an argument that was super successful. They're both very, almost clinical in a way, but it's just very objective, just going through the elements and describing what the author did to present the argument. Do your best. I know this is a one-shot deal because it's the final exam essay, but I hope you feel somewhat prepared for it already, because the options that you were given to choose from to write on are things that we have already looked at and discussed throughout the quarter. You're going to be given 5 options, and each option is one of the visuals that we covered in one of the weekly discussions. So you have already looked at each of these images. You have already posted your answers to the discussion questions, and the discussion questions are very similar to what you do in like steps 1 and 2 and 3 that were presented in this PowerPoint. You already watched my follow-up video to each of the options, and then you had a follow-up journal entry on each of the options. So you have already thought about these arguments throughout the quarter. Now it's time to sort of go back and dig a little bit deeper and then present an essay on it. But the topics that you're choosing are not new. You are familiar with them. And we've worked a lot on how to analyze argument, how arguments work. Trust that you know how to do this. And then just don't forget that it is an essay. Have that introductory paragraph with your thesis statement. Have your body paragraphs that are ordered in a logical way. Make sure each body paragraph has a good transitional topic sentence. So the first thing the first thing about this argument that we notice is the claim, and then you go on to talk about the claim and explain it. The second thing we notice about the argument is how it uses logic to help support the claim. And then you discuss how logic is used. And in addition to using logic, the argument also focuses heavily on pathos. And then you give us those examples. So don't forget, it is an actual essay. Introductory paragraph with thesis statements, body paragraphs organized in a way that is logical and makes sense, transitional topic sentences that guide us through each paragraph, and then a conclusion that wraps everything up. You know how to do this. You just take a deep breath and go through the steps and then figure out how you want to put it all together. It is just a final exam essay. I'm not expecting it to be more than 5 to 7 paragraphs probably. So if you give me a standard 5-paragraph essay, introduction, 3 body paragraphs, conclusion, as long as each paragraph, each main point is fully supported, and I can tell that you really worked through the argument, you're going to be fine, okay? If you have any questions about this PowerPoint and the basics of writing a rhetorical analysis essay, please let me know. You're gonna do some more groundwork for that final exam essay before you actually have to write it. So, just know that there's a little more practice coming your way. But if you have any questions right now in the moment, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, you guys are good to go ahead and move on to the next item in the module.